Hello everyone, welcome back to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 3, The Age of Exploration. So last time we looked at the Renaissance, and remember there was, you'll remember the urban nobility that developed from the intermarriage between the old noble families and the growing merchant class, the merchant families. They married together because the nobles realized just how amazing the wealth from trade could be. So they have their wealth both from the land of the old nobles as well as trade. Trade is becoming more and more important as we go on. And this is pretty much, the Age of Exploration is pretty much right in the middle of the same time as the Renaissance. The urban nobility also became so powerful that they could rule these now growing cities, and we saw that with the De Medici in Florence, and they were not the only ones who came to control the cities that they were around. In turn, some of these cities could become powerful enough to rule the area around them. First off, they were wealthy enough that they could buy their freedom from kingdoms. You know, they just pay the king around them some money to be free. And then over time, they become powerful enough that they don't really need to pay the king that much anymore. And they actually begin to control the areas around themselves. Here's Florence. We see the city there, and then the area that they control. Also the case with Milan up here. Milan, the city, the area that Milan controlled. Venice, the area that Venice controlled. And Genoa, which we'll see someone famous later in this lecture from Genoa. So trade being so important, you could see the network of land and water routes that stretched across Europe. Lots through the land here, and the water routes that did exist stayed very, very close to the coast. They hugged the coast, and they were throughout the Mediterranean, which is a much shallower body of water than the Atlantic Ocean is. But when they were out on the ocean, they stuck by the coast so as not to, get in too much trouble from any storms or any waves out there. We also want to make note of Constantinople right here, right at the bridge between Europe and Asia. This will be more important and will be one of the driving factors of trade, as we will see when the Ottoman Empire takes over Constantinople. And I also want to bring your notice down to here. The very tip of Africa is a little place called Ceuta, and we'll see that as well. Through Constantinople and Ceuta, we can also see that these European routes were connected to larger routes. So yeah, these European routes are connected to routes in Africa, the Middle East, and all the way out into East Asia. Now, the longer that a good traveled on these routes, the more expensive it became. And to give you an idea of how this works, let's imagine we have a good out here in China. Let's say, I don't know, a piece of porcelain that sells for, let's just say, 10 gold. Just a random number. So there's this nice set of porcelain that merchants want for 10 gold. So one merchant buys it for 10 gold. Now he sells it to the next merchant along the path here, but he needs to make some money off of it, right? So he'll sell it for 20 gold. Now the merchant who just bought it for 20 gold, he's going to take it over here, and he's also going to want to make a profit. So maybe he'll sell it for 30 gold. This merchant now just bought it for 30 gold. He'll sell it over here for 40 gold, so on and so forth along this path here through the Middle East, through Turkey, or modern-day Turkey, and then into Europe itself. Now, if you're in England, it has to go all the way through Europe as well. So that's how middlemen make prices go up. Each middleman is going to want to cut, Every time a middleman buys a good, it's going to increase. Let's say somehow a merchant from England gets all the way to China himself. Well, he still has to travel along these paths. And if he wants protection or wants guidance through this, wants places to stay, he's going to have to pay for that. So that's going to make the good more expensive as well. After 1400, the Ottoman Turks also began to come to power right here in modern-day Turkey, in Anatolia. They spread out this way, and they spread out this way into the Byzantine Empire, and will actually force the Byzantine Empire to collapse in 1453. The Ottoman Empire has, sometimes they work okay with Europe, other times they're at war with European countries. And you can imagine, if they're at war with a European country, are they going to let trade goods come through? Probably not. So that's one major route, then, that they can just completely cut off, not let any goods get in through Europe. Yeah, and then they have to go through these routes up here, or these routes around here. So the Ottoman Empire also drives up the cost and makes goods a lot rarer for Europe. What kind of goods did the Europeans want? Well, they could want porcelain from China. You know, sometimes we still call it China, like the good itself, we still call it China. Like people will have a China cabinet where they'll have nice pieces of porcelain. That's because porcelain comes from China. Silk. Here's a 14th century silk Chinese robe. There were also spices throughout this area, throughout China, throughout the Southeast Asia below China, and in India. Things like peppercorn. Here we can see different types of peppercorn there. India is very famous for its peppercorn, as are other parts of Southeast Asia. Cloves, another spice, found in India, Southeast Asia, as is nutmeg. Sugar. That's from islands in Southeast Asia. There's also opium up in northwest India. Poppies, poppy seed. India was also well known for its cotton cloth that it produced. These wonderfully dyed pieces of cotton cloth with nice little patterns on them. Very, very nice, and it could be expensive. There's also sandalwood, which was used for its fragrance. It smelled very nice. It would create a nice aroma. There's ivory, which could be found in India or Africa. Nice, something that you could carve into and create very, very nice sculptures of. And we see some examples of carved elephant tusk here. And of course, gold, especially found in Western Africa. So those are the kinds of exotic trade goods that Europeans want. But there's all kinds of middlemen getting in the way, sometimes even people blocking them from getting these goods. Now, before we look into the European invasion of this trade, of the existing trade routes, or circumnavigation around these trade routes, I want to talk briefly about the Indian Ocean trade. There had been trade between East Africa, so right down here, the Swahili city-states, and Southeast Asia before the Europeans got there. This trade was dictated by monsoons. Twice a year, monsoons would come in and basically grind trade to a halt. They would last for months, and then once they went away, you could trade for a little bit, and then the next one came, and you had to wait again. Monsoons are seasonal windy rainstorms in this area. And so, in order to continue to trade or to keep possession of their goods, these Muslim traders who originally came from the Swahili city-states, they set up storage centers in Southeast Asia. So, they get all these goods, and the goods that they can't get back to the Swahili city-states before the monsoons come, they now have these depots, more or less, stored up where they can keep all these goods. Malacca being one of the most prominent ones. There's Malacca there. It's right on the Straits of Malacca, which is between Malaysia and Indonesia. So, important because that's where a lot of goods were stored. It also controls that passageway. Malacca is going to be a very important place. Now, when we talk about the Age of Exploration, we have to talk about Portugal. Around 1400, the Portuguese were looking to expand their economy. You can see them right here in this red. There's the little tiny country of Portugal. A lot of their trade with Europe is being blocked right now by the Kingdom of Castile here and Aragon here. I mean, of course, they have boats and they can get here like this. But, for our purposes, just imagine that these two Spanish countries are blocking a lot of what could come by land, at least. So it's hard for the Portuguese to get goods, and they're very expensive. So the Portuguese decide that instead of looking to Europe, try and get the goods from their sources more directly. They start to want goods coming from the gold and ivory coast in Africa, and that's right down here. Yeah, I mean, you can even see this little region called the Gold Coast. But the gold and ivory coast, pretty much right down here, good for gold and ivory, not surprising. Also very good for slaves. Now, there is a traditional way to get to the gold and ivory coast. Europeans would trade with these North African cities around here. There's one right up on the very tip that we mentioned earlier, Ceuta, there. And those cities, so they would trade with the merchants in those cities, and those cities would get their goods from down here through trade routes that went through the Sahara Desert. Now, the Sahara Desert is about 1,000 miles north to south. To give you a rough estimate of what that is, from here in Buffalo down to Atlanta is about 900. So we're talking about basically the United States, north to south, that is having to be crossed, and it's all desert. There are little oases in between, little spots of green and water that you can stop at, but it's a very hard terrain, and it took about 3 months to cross. Here's a look at it. You can see it's very, very dry. The highs in the temperature throughout the year can reach around 117 degrees Fahrenheit. And at the same time, the lows at night can dip below freezing. That's an extreme, usually when it's 117, it's not going to go below freezing, but there are massive temperature swings depending on the day and the night. There are also sandstorms that occur. And here's a picture of a sandstorm there. Just these massive windstorms that whip up sand, can bury you. They're very painful to be in. So what you need to get through this very, very rough terrain are guides. And the guides in the Sahara Desert on the western side are tribes of Berbers. So these desert people would lead your merchants through the desert. They'd take you to the oases because they knew where they were. You didn't, but they did. So they would take you there. But they were middlemen, so they of course wanted a cut for leading you there. And it would be pretty high. The Berbers also could have a reputation of robbing you. If they didn't like the price that you were offering them, or they decided to renegotiate, they could just straight up rob you and leave you, to the elements. or they could force you to pay them even more. So the Berbers made this trip a little bit difficult. In 1415, we see the first stepping point for the Portuguese trade. In 1415, they capture that city on the tip of Africa, Ceuta, here. Ceuta also controls the trade going through the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean, and it cuts off the last group of middlemen, right? If you control the city, you no longer have to, worry about the merchants there taking an extra cut. So you cut down one section of middlemen. It gives them a foothold in Africa, and like I said, it's really the stepping stone. It gives them an idea for, why not? So if they can take over this area here, why can't they take over, or at least create a foothold in the Gold and Ivory Coast? The question is, how are you going to cut out the Berber middlemen, right? You can't just, go through the desert alone. You need them if you're going to go through the desert. But what the Portuguese decide to do is to forget the desert altogether. And they decide that they are going to go by ship around the coast of Africa here to reach the Gold and Ivory Coast. Now this is a big deal, because at this time, no European knows how large Africa is. In fact, there might be no one in the world who knows how long Africa is. Sure, they know the accounts of the Sahara Desert and all that, but to come down here, they didn't really know how long that would take. Luckily, the Portuguese explorers had a major patron, a very important figure. One of the king's sons, Prince Henry, was a key supporter in these exploration quests. He becomes so influential in the fact that he's the money for these trips that he gets the nickname the Navigator. So Prince Henry the Navigator, he sponsored trips for exploration, and in return, he would get 20% of the profits. So, you'd go to Prince Henry and you'd say, I have this idea to get down to the Gold and Ivory Coast. And he'd say, okay, here's the money for it, but 20% of the profits that you bring back are mine. And it's quite obvious from this picture why Prince Henry would want profits, right? I mean, look at this silly hat. You can't buy a hat like that for a little bit of money. Silly hats like that probably cost a fortune. Not only are they very fashionable, but we all know what happens when your hat is not silly enough. And Prince Henry the Navigator does not want this to happen to him. So obviously he needs money so that he can keep buying more and more silly hats. Once the Portuguese land in the Gold Coast, start setting up their foothold there, they decide to keep going further and further. And again, I'm going to emphasize this. No one knows how long Africa is. The Portuguese now just found out that, the Gold Coast is right here, and this is the length that it takes to get there by sea. They think that maybe if they keep going this way, they'll get around Africa. But no, you got to keep going down here like this. So they're going further and further, trying to find a way around Africa. And in 1487, they actually get around this little area here called the Cape of Good Hope. Bartholomew Diaz gets around it, but is forced to go back. And how is he forced to go back? Well, the reason why it's called the Cape of Good Hope is you basically have to hope for the best to get around it. The winds are very, very strange there. There are often storms that could, destroy your ships. So it's an ordeal to get around it. Bartholomew Diaz gets around it in 1487, but he's forced to go back. And it isn't until 1497, 10 years later, when Vasco da Gama gets around it in 1497 and keeps going. He stops off around the Swahili city-states, trading with them, and in 1498 he lands in India. He sets up some trading posts there, and he starts his trek back around the Cape of Good Hope, back to Portugal. And he lands back in Portugal in 1499. They have those trading posts set up there now in India and around the Swahili city-states. But this was a very, very costly trip. About one half of his fleet is lost from, the storms around the Cape of Good Hope, or around other storms. Half of the fleet is lost. That's a lot of manpower, a lot of money going into ships. And it might not seem worth it, right? Half of the people died, half of the ships are gone. But they make so much money from the goods that they get in India that the Portuguese just decide, yes, this is absolutely worth it. So, sailors lost be damned. They're going to keep going. And what we see then, by 1500, the Portuguese lay claim to Brazil in South America. So the New World has been discovered. They don't want to be, they realize how important trade can be and how important different areas can be. So they send out people, or their own explorers, and in 1500 claim Brazil. In 1511, after Vasco da Gama gets over in India, they're going to keep pushing further and further, and in 1511, they capture that trading depot, Malacca. So now they control this very important storage city and the key city that controls the Straits of Malacca. That trading route that goes through this little passage here, they control the city that controls that. Portugal is a very tiny country, as we saw. How were they able to go so far and be so successful? A lot of it has to do with new technology. There is a new ship called the Caravel. The Caravel is a combination of a cog, which is an Atlantic merchant ship. It's got this deep keel, so you're not only stable in the ocean waters, the deep ocean waters, but you also have a lot of room for goods that go in the ship. And it's also a combination of that cog with a galley, which is a Mediterranean warship. It's got a very shallow keel, highly maneuverable, and you can't have a deep keel in the Mediterranean Sea because the sea isn't as deep, and you run a chance of running aground, and that'd be bad. So the Caravel is this medium-keeled ship. It doesn't have a deep keel like the cog. It doesn't have a shallow keel like the galley. It's kind of like, the baby bear's porridge in Goldilocks. It's just right. It's a combination of them. It's medium-keeled, so it's more stable in the ocean, but it's still able to go into more shallow waters as well. This medium keel also allowed for the storage of some goods. Maybe not as many as in a cog, but the trade-off is there. It still has room for some goods. The Caravel also is equipped with these lateen sails, these triangular sails here. These lateen sails made it possible for the ship to sail against the wind. So expert sailors could use the sails to keep going forward even when the wind is against them. Caravels also were equipped with cannons. By 1350, cannons had become very important, and especially after 1453, when the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire defeats Constantinople, the importance of cannons is obvious. So they decide to put cannons on ships. Now the ships are able to defend themselves, from pirates, but they're also able to attack any ports that won't open up to them. So let's say, they end up in India, but the local people don't want to let them in. These ships can now just fire their cannons at them until the local people are forced to let them in. It's also a good way to force your control over them, right? With these cannons, what happens is you have to tie them down. You have these ropes that go across that are tied to the cannon so that when it fires, it doesn't go just flying off the deck. And I'm sure that has happened in tests, but they realized we better tie these down because there is a lot of kickback on cannons. Navigational tools also develop. The magnetic compass comes into Europe in the 13th century, and it's eventually adopted for navigation. Obviously, a compass is used to give yourself a sense of direction, and I say that it came into Europe in the 13th century. China had been using a magnetic compass for navigation since the 11th century. So a full 200 years earlier, China had been using these, but the Europeans they developed them as well later, and they used them for navigation. And here's an example of what a compass would look like for a ship. There's also the astrolabe. The astrolabe, the ancient Greeks in 150 BCE had an early type of astrolabe, and it's kind of improved upon over time. The Muslims in the 12th century further developed it, Muslim scholars, creating a very, very nice astrolabe, and it makes its way into Europe during the time of the Age of Exploration. What an astrolabe does for you is it helps you tell time. It kind of maps out the night sky for you, which can help with navigation, right? The astrolabe is so important that the author Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales, he wrote an instruction manual for the astrolabe for his son. So a neat little side note there. On top of the magnetic compass and the astrolabe, Europeans are also getting a better understanding of maps, how to draw maps, how to read them better, and geography in general. Motivation for exploration. We talked earlier about trade and how, the merchants want more and more money, and how they realize that if they can cut the middlemen out of it and also get around the Ottoman Turks, the price of goods will go down for them and they can make more money when they bring it back to Europe. Portugal and Spain also have further motivation in the idea that they want to spread Christianity. They're both very, very Catholic countries, and they see exploration as a way of spreading their faith. Governments then sponsor these trips for commercial gain as well as religious gain. And we're in the middle of the Renaissance, right? So we saw this new curiosity and this new rediscovering of ancient Greece and Rome. There's also a curiosity in general about the world during the time of the Renaissance. And really, from the Renaissance on, people are going to be pretty curious about the world. So, this curiosity about the world is also one of the driving factors in European exploration. (1492). Very, very important year. But before we get to the famous voyage that, whenever you say 1492 probably is the first thing that springs to your mind, there were other big events that were kind of closely related to that voyage. The first being that Spain was united by the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. So remember those two kingdoms that we looked at that were bordering Portugal at the beginning of the lecture? Ferdinand, who's the king of Aragon, the one on the east, and Isabella, the queen of Castile, the one on the west, they marry, thus uniting those two kingdoms. And Spain is born out of this. Those two kingdoms unite into Spain, and together, with the combined forces of those two former kingdoms, they are able to drive the Muslim Moors who are living in the southern part of Spain out of the country completely. So they push them out into North Africa, and this is called the Reconquista. The Reconquista, the Spanish drive out the Muslim Moors from Spain. Both Ferdinand and Isabella were very Catholic, and during their reign, they also ejected the Jewish population from the country. So not only have they driven out the Muslim Moors out of it, they've now forced the Jewish population from their homes, and they seize all the land from the Jewish population and the Muslims and their money. So Spain is just sitting there with a lot of new money, and they're looking for ways to invest it. They notice that this small little country that is their neighbor has gotten very, very rich from exploration, right? And they're jealous of that, right? The small little country shouldn't be as rich, or shouldn't be richer than Spain, they think. We've now got this money, we're going to invest in exploration as well. But Portugal's in control of the way around Africa. They discovered it. They're the ones who realize how to do it easily. They know the way around it. They control it with their own ships, and they're also more experienced in general. So if they try and go around Africa, the Portuguese are going to stop them. So how do you get to India if you can't go around Africa? They happen to hire some guy you may have heard of. A guy named Christopher Columbus. He is an Italian sailor. He's from Genoa. And he had been going across Europe for a few years trying to find people to fund his trip. He had this idea that if he sails west, he can get to India. This fits in perfectly with what the Spanish crown is looking for, right? They're looking for a way to get to Asia and India without going around Africa. So if you can go west, that's perfect. Now, there's all kinds of romantic ideas that, Christopher Columbus was the only person in the world who thought the world was round. That's not true. He was definitely not the only person who thought the world was round. The idea had been around since the ancient Greek and Romans. A lot of, learned people during the Renaissance would have thought that the world was round. So he's not the only one who, most of the people who've learned and studied don't think you're going to go tipping off the side if you just sail west. They don't think you're just going to fall off the world. One thing that Christopher Columbus did believe was that India was 3,000 miles away from Spain if you sailed west. This is a massive underestimate of how long it would take, of how far it is. It is actually 8,000 miles away if you go west. So he believes that the world is much smaller than it actually is. And this could have been really, really bad for Christopher Columbus. You know, he has provisions that will last a little bit longer than 3,000 miles, but he doesn't have provisions that are going to last for 8,000 miles. Luckily for him, there was land that happened to be around 3,000 miles to the west. In fact, these were whole other continents, but they weren't India. 5 weeks into his voyage, they spotted a small chain of islands and made land eventually. The natives were very, very friendly to the Spaniards who came with Columbus. They gave him some gold that they had, which wasn't very much. It's not a very gold-rich area, but they gave him some. And Columbus looks around, and he realizes quickly that this area is not as rich as India. So, kind of imagine for 1 second that you're Christopher Columbus. You spent all this time convincing people to fund your trip, your 3,000-mile trip to India. You finally find the King and Queen of Spain, who have given you a lot of money to equip your ships and give you sailors and some soldiers, and then you come up a little short, right? The area you find is not rich like India is. What do? You know, you got to think in his mind, he's like, oh crap, this is not good. So what Columbus has to do is then convince the Spaniards that this is going to be worthwhile. Sure, we didn't find India, we didn't find as many riches, but there are still lots of good things about this new world that I did find. One of the things he hears from the locals are rumors that there are a lot richer areas to the west. Things like the mainland, like the Aztec Empire and the Incan Empire. He hears rumors about that. So he can kind of, you know, that's a selling point for Columbus to the Spanish king and queen. The area that he did land in also had naturally good harbors, right? And nice areas to put your ships. The land seemed very, very fertile. And he looked at these natives who were very, very nice to him, and he says, maybe we could use these natives as free labor for this fertile land. So, you know, if we bring crops over, we can force these very nice people to work them for us. That way we don't have to do it ourselves. And with these arguments, he is able to convince Isabella and Ferdinand to make him admiral of the Spanish Navy, and they agree to give him 3 more voyages. He's also given the title of Governor of the New World. So, he's pretty convincing, right? I didn't land in India, you know, I didn't find all these spices, but here's what I do have. And he's able to convince them to keep giving him money for more voyages, to give him the title of admiral, and make him governor of the New World. On his second voyage to the New World, Columbus brings with him sugarcane from Southeast Asia, right? It's been brought up into Europe. He's able to get some of it, and he brings it to the New World, where he then forces the natives to work the land for sugarcane, and we'll look into this a little bit later in the semester. Just the process of, you know, growing and refining sugar. After the voyages of Columbus, the Spanish keep exploring the New World. They sent conquistadors like Hernando Cortez and Francisco Pizarro to conquer native empires. Hernando Cortez conquered the Aztecs using his technological advantages. You can see they have gunpowder, they have metal swords, they have crossbows here, they have horses, metal armor, against the Aztecs, who have their obsidian-bladed swords, not really armor at all. He also gets very, very lucky in that one time the Aztecs did surround him, and it's looking really bad for Cortez. But the Aztecs didn't push the attack. They didn't keep attacking Cortez, because to the Aztecs, warfare had the ceremonial aspect to it. So they didn't keep on pushing against Cortez, which gave him enough time for his reinforcements to arrive, and he was able to, conquer the Aztecs. Pizarro, down in South America, when he was fighting the Incans, he was lucky enough that during that time there was a civil war between two brothers who were trying to rule the Incan Empire. And he took advantage of that civil war. Once one of the brothers won, Pizarro tricked this king to meet him unarmed. So Pizarro says, just come meet me unarmed, and we'll discuss what's going on. Maybe we'll trade. And not surprisingly, Pizarro arrests the Incan emperor, and he ransoms him for a bunch of gold. So he forces the Incan people to pay him a bunch of gold, and then he still ended up hanging this emperor because he made up some charges of a crime. So Pizarro conquers the Incans through a little bit of treachery. The Spanish send other conquistadors throughout North and South America, conquering the smaller tribes, and once the conquistadors did their work in conquering, the Spanish sent over governors to rule over areas. And what this meant was the governors watch over the area and they make sure that Spain is getting rich off the New World, right? The whole point of the New World to Spain was to get as much out of it as they could, to get richer and richer. They also sent missionaries to spread Catholicism. Like we said, one of the major motivations for the Spanish and the Portuguese was spreading their religion, so missionaries are sent. And later in the semester, we'll see what results from this Spanish colonialism. So keep this in the back of your mind when we come up to that. This ends our discussion of the Age of Exploration. Now, next time, in our next lecture, we're going to look at the development of the system of absolute monarchy in 17th and 18th century France. So until then, this is Greg signing off.